Hey, welcome back, wormlings. Today we will be talking about ADHD and its intersectionalities, right? So it's chapter 11. Kind of crazy. Can't believe we already at chapter 11. We already got 2 more chapters to go. Um, and then that's it. But yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Okay. So the author has spent the majority of the book speaking about the common experiences ADHDers have had across the board, right? But for this chapter, as I mentioned earlier, she wanted to touch on the differences in our experiences. Now, there's many biological, psychological, and socio-environmental factors that affect people across the globe, including us. Things like our race, gender, class, and nationality. And these things can often determine how our ADHD behaviors are perceived by others, if and how we get diagnosed, and what kind of treatment we receive. So back in, I believe it was 2020, she mentioned her mother died. And when that happened, the grief completely overtook her mental functioning, and this triggered a lot of childhood trauma to come up. Because of this, she had went ahead and signed up for a peer support group, and she got into trauma therapy. And this is when she found out that a lot of the symptoms that she's experienced over the years that she blamed solely on her ADHD were actually influenced by other factors as well, right? So her ADHD plus her trauma led to the emotional dysregulation. Her ADHD and her anxiety led to her impulsivity. And then her ADHD and neurotypical plus the neurotypical and gendered expectations of society led to her self-esteem issues. It wasn't just the ADHD alone that was the culprit, right? Upon this discovery, she realized that she could address the second half of the equation and in turn make life a lot easier for herself. So this is when she also started to really learn how the cross-section of other identities impacted people's lives with ADHD, and realized that she had been so focused on the ADHD only that she hadn't considered the individual differences in others' lives. So let's go ahead and dip into what we have learned in this chapter, okay? So with ADHD, coexisting conditions are more often the rule than the exception. So we're going to talk about not only the conditions, but the factors that we've learned that could affect our lives with ADHD, and for the rest of this video. So the first thing would be the psychological factors. And about 60 to 80% of adults with ADHD have at least one of the conditions we're about to touch on. And guys, remember, as always, whenever we're talking about statistics, remember that statistics are a good source, but oftentimes they can only capture so much data, right? And you also have to think about cultural context and what's not when you look at when you look at statistics. Got to keep that in mind, So when you're looking at this right here, the 60 to 80%, there's a good chance that the number, or there's a great chance, the number is definitely higher than 60 to 80%. So keep that in mind with all the factors that we touch on, that most of them are probably actually in real life higher than whatever it is that they've been able to capture themselves. And there might be some that are probably lower, but for the most part, the rule of thumb with statistics is it's always going to be higher than whatever number they get, for the most part. So we're going to go ahead and touch on the neurodevelopmental coexisting conditions that are common with ADHD, okay? The first would be autism. I think a lot of us know what autism are by now, and it's usually referred to, the combination of the two is referred to as ADHD, right? The next would be tic disorders. Now, less than 10% of ADHDers have tic disorders, but 60 to 80% of people with Tourette syndrome have ADHD. The next would be learning disabilities, and 43 to 55% of ADHDers have learning disabilities versus 5 to 5% in neurotypical people. Let's go ahead and kind of dip into the different kinds of learning disabilities. One of them being dyslexia, which affects reading and related skills. Dyscalculia, which affects math-related skills. Dysgraphia, which is a learning and fine motor disability that affects handwriting and, it kind of gives you difficulty in, when it comes to writing quickly and legibly. The next would be giftedness, which is intellectually gifted people, which isn't, in my opinion, that's not really a condition per se, but I guess it was included in here because some people struggle to get access to support for their ADHD, like a fucking TV. Okay, but some people struggle to get help for their ADHD because they're gifted. For me, I don't have any of these other coexisting conditions. I feel like some of them would definitely be obvious if I did. But what I do have is giftedness. I was enrolled into the gifted program when I was in the first grade, and I was in the gifted program from first grade to I think I had gotten out of it before I went into high school. The reason being more so because I kept trying to tell my mom, like, hey, they might have put me in gifted back when I was in elementary school and stuff, but I can't do this. Like, I can't handle, you know what I'm saying, like these classes that I'm getting put in, you know, like I'm struggling a lot, you know. And at first my mom did not want to take me out of gifted, but eventually she did, and so I went ahead and went into regular classes. It seems like I was doing fine until 7th grade hit. That's what I do remember. 7th grade is when I'm like, yeah, I'm not. We touched on the neurodevelopmental conditions that can coexist with ADHD. So now let's go ahead and touch on the non-neurodevelopmental coexisting conditions with ADHD. Okay, it's a lot. It's a handful coming out my mouth. And the only difference between that and you know, we talked about earlier is that it's not a result of differences in brain development, whereas the other is, right? So some of the conditions can be depression, anxiety, oppositional defiant disorder, which is ODD, and 40% of ADHDers have ODD versus neurotypical. In neurotypical people, only 4% have ODD. So I'm going to go ahead and read directly from the book here. So according to Dr. Sharon Saline, it's important to recognize that those who are oppositional aren't oppositional with everyone or every task. Oppositional behavior is a relationship issue, and it is relationship dependent. Sometimes the relationship issue is with the person. Sometimes the issue is related to our relationship with the task, right? And so when it comes to ODD, a lot of people question the validity, and I'm one of those people that questions the validity of ODD entirely. Because to be quite honest, when you look at what ODD is, it doesn't really sound to me personally like as much of a disorder. Because if it's something that exists, you know, solely with like in relationships, you know what I'm saying, or with, you know, the relationship someone has with the task, I'm not sure that's really a disorder, you know what I'm saying. Like if you are always opposing your partners, like maybe that's a character issue, you know. These are just my personal thoughts on it. Maybe this is more of an emotional problem going on, you know what I'm saying. I'm not sure if it really deserves its own whole entire like categorization of a disorder, because it sounds to me like maybe some therapy could resolve this. Now, I'm not trying to say that it's not a problem at all, but I'm one of those people that question it. Okay, so the next thing would be trauma-related disorders, and 10% of ADHDers actually have PTSD versus 1% in neurotypical people. Think about that as you will. And the next would be substance use disorders, where 25% of ADHDers have it versus 13% of neurotypical people that can coexist is eating disorders, right? And these are actually more common with ADHD adolescents, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if these tendencies followed through into adulthood, because the person who, you know, did this study and stuff, they were focusing on adolescents specifically, but, you know, realistically, a lot of times these behaviors follow past teenagehood, you know. Some of them that are very common within ADHDers, like adolescents specifically, was what the study wasn't about, but, you know, like I said, are bulimia and binge eating disorders, which is like eating excessively, then, you know, forcing it all out. And then avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which is ARFID, and it's when you severely restrict the amount of nutrition that you're taking in due to the fear of either the food itself or of what will happen as a result of eating the food. I'm not sure if I've ever had ARFID, you know, but, and, you know, I'm just going to speak on my personal experience where, like, I started having health issues at the very tail end of, like, 2023 that followed me until, like, present day. I would say 2024 was probably the worst of it. 2025, it's gotten a lot better now. It's not as bad as it used to be. And because of these issues, I became paranoid because, like, with any kind of food that I would eat, because everything triggered me. Like, I couldn't, for a long time in my life, like, everything I ate, you know, gave me pain, you know, gave me fatigue, gave me just, like, so many problems. And so I became, like, very scared to eat food almost. I would say, honestly, I was spending most of my time on my feet, and when I wasn't on my feet, I would just be, like, out in the bed. And the reason I was on my feet all day is because I would have to make stuff from scratch as much as possible. Like, I could not pre-buy a lot of things. I had to make a lot of things myself. And those things took time, you know. So I would be up, like, for long periods of times of the day, you know. And then my partner, you know, she had to work like 2 jobs at the time to support us during this period of time. And yeah, it was not a fun time. Like, when I look at what ARFID is, I kind of like think about, like, I don't know, I might have had ARFID, but it wasn't something that just kind of developed out of nowhere. It's because I started having a health issue. So I'm like, I don't know if that counts when you, like, dead ass having like actual issues, you know what I'm saying? Continuing on, there's also disordered eating, which is eating or thinking about food in a way that negatively impacts our lives but does not meet the criteria for an eating disorder, which this can be due to body image issues, sensory issues, interoception issues, which that means the awareness of your body's internal senses or signals. That's what interoception means, so issues with that, and also and or executive function deficits, right? And something worth mentioning is that there's a common problem of people wanting to eat a whole lot when they get off the ADHD meds. And the reason for this is because stimulant medication suppresses your appetite. So if you haven't been eating all day and it wears off, right, your brain's going to start screaming at you to pack in all the nutrients that your body needs. And in the case that you've been eating normally while you were on the meds, a few, like, you know, because that's if you wasn't eating all day. But if you was eating like normal meals throughout the day, and you know, and it's still happening, the reasons that this could be that, you know, your ADHD impulsivity just kicks in the minute it wears off, or you're just not getting enough dopamine, you know, after it wears off, so you find it in the foods that give it to you, right? I myself haven't taken ADHD meds, but this is kind of explanation that the same, you know, doctor that did this study came up with, right? So third factor that we're looking to is biological factors. The first biological factor that we're going to touch on that can coexist, or, you know, that can make your ADHD harder to deal with, is hormones, right? One of the things they touch on is, of course, when we're going through puberty, right? When we're young, you know, with the boys, the influx of testosterone, with girls, the influx of estrogen, you know, in that pre-puberty phase, and, you know, while you're going through that puberty phase, as you would think, you know, it increases things like that impulsivity and what's not, and causes problems. And also, you know, once the girls get their period, like, the hormonal fluctuations can be intensified. You know, you combine that with the ADHD, just think of any time hormones rise, the ADHD can also get the button, right? So the second factor would be biological sex. When it comes to, you know, boys and girls, right? Boys oftentimes have a tendency to display more of the hyperactive traits, while the girls have a tendency to display the inattentive ones. And, you know, this can lead to the girls not getting diagnosed as often because the presentation, right, that oftentimes doctors are looking for is the hyperactive one, not the other one. But at the same time, it can also be missed in boys who have a more inattentive presentation. It's just more so the fact that, like, girls are usually the ones that have that type of presentation at a young age. But at the end of the day, too, though, once we start becoming adults, our presentations can also change, and the way that our ADHD looks can also change. And I guess that's going into the next, you know, biological factor, age, right? Can be a barrier, or it can be a factor that can, you know, collide, because as we get older, overall, all of us start to take on a more inattentive presentation for the most part, and that could lead to it not getting diagnosed because they're usually not looking for that, right? But at the same time, you know, the symptoms are still there. Like, the impulsivity is not going to look the same as when you were a kid as when you were an adult, so it might get brushed off a little easier. Like we kind of lightly touched on earlier, pregnancy is the next one, because there's not a lot of research on pregnancy and, like, stimulant medication. A lot of doctors are very much reluctant to prescribing medications, you know, to their patients while they're pregnant. But, you know, this can be very conflicting, and it could actually end up being detrimental to the way a person's day-to-day life becomes with pregnancy, because of the fact that a lot of them are hesitant to prescribe, to, you know, allow that, you know, you to take your medication. Still, you know, stress levels can really start to rise, and of course your pregnancy symptoms are heightened because the hormonal, going back to the hormones again, right? Your hormones are elevated, and that in turn affects other factors of your ADHD. The next one would be migraines, which I did not know that can coincide with ADHD. But apparently migraine disorders are actually very common in the ADHD community. In one study, men with ADHD were twice as likely to experience migraines compared to non-ADHD men. Crazy, right? Who would have thought? The next thing would be a chronic pain. When it comes to chronic pain, there's good, bad, and so-so days. But when you're also combating the good, bad, and so-so days of your brain, of your ADHD brain, that can lead to a much worse experience than just having the chronic pain by itself. Question for myself: have I noticed any of these impacts for me? I have been dealing with migraines ever since I was a teenager, ever since I got my goddamn period. That year that I got my period, it was about like a week and a half or something before my 13th birthday. And that year of 13 is when I started to experience migraines for the first time. I believe it was headaches. I think it started off as just, headaches, and then it quickly turned into migraines. And I have been suffering from migraines ever since then. Especially when I was like a teenager in the thick of my puberty, my hormones. It was bad. It was so bad. Nowadays it's not as bad, but I'm also not as physically, I'm not as like, you know, my body is weaker than it was, you know, than when I was younger. So it's a lot, I would say, harder to get through it. You know, the fourth thing would be the socio-environmental factors. First thing is culture, right? And the way that culture can impact it is, as we all know, some cultures are a little bit more open to addressing mental health concerns, whereas other cultures are not. And as you would assume, yeah, it can get a little harder to get diagnosed when there's a lot of cultural stigma around things like that. And also, some cultures are just very much don't emphasize, and I guess that goes hand in hand with stigma, don't emphasize the research into, you know, mental health and stuff. So a lot of times people don't even realize certain things are problems. And the next would be socialization or social expectations, right? When it comes to ADHDers, we're actually more often gender non-conforming. And just overall, ADHDers have difficulties meeting gender-based expectations, which isn't a problem in and of itself, right? That's not the problem. It's more so that society's expectations of things can make it harder for one to just exist in their day-to-day whilst also having the ADHD. So I don't really believe in having to sit here and adhere to a lot of stupid-ass social expectations. The next would be religion. People can oftentimes end up dealing with a lot of shame, or oftentimes, you know, when they really need support for their ADHD, they're kind of met with solutions that aren't really good solutions, you know what I'm saying, because of their religion. And it can cause a lot of people to feel like they're you know, they're not doing well in the eyes of whatever the religion is, like they're a bad person or whatever, because they can't meet these expectations and because they're not doing things the way that they're supposed to, quote unquote. The next would be ethnicity and race. Of course, it's no surprise, you know, that especially in America, I think, because I think this is where these, you know, a lot of these studies are geared, where, you know, when it comes to Black, Latinx, and Asian children, compared to white children, the odds of getting, you know, and I'm paraphrasing here, but like the odds of getting diagnosed and getting treatment are much lower, you know, than white children. I mean, I guess, you know, a living example of that. And honestly, that's kind of just a statistic that is like, that's a rule of thumb for like so many things, you know, across the globe. You know, when we're comparing people of color to non-people of color, we could see that statistic reign true for so many different facets of life, to be honest. The next would be, which I guess this kind of cross-sects with ethnicity and race, but socioeconomic status. When you're in a higher tax bracket and you're struggling with certain ADHD things, you can go and seek out the help that you need for that. You could pay for the help, in whatever way that might look. But when you don't have the money to do so, life starts to get, day-to-day life and day-to-day tasks get a lot more difficult because you don't have the money to bring in the ease that having money would, right? The next would be access to care. This is like a global kind of issue. Even in the US, while she was writing this book, there was a stimulant medication shortage. You know, there's some countries like Russia where stimulant medications, I don't know if that's still the case, but while she was writing this book, it's literally illegal. Stimulant medications are literally illegal. Over in the UK, when she was writing this, there was like a years-long wait list. So it's not always easy to access, you know, the medications that people need. You know, that's a big thing that can make life a lot harder. And then last thing would be changing demands. And that's basically just like lifing. You know, when big things happen in life, it can take a toll on the ADHD brain, you know what I'm saying? So things like moving, getting married, like whether it's positive or negative changes, these things can get very overwhelming very fast. Have I noticed any impacts on myself with these factors? So within my culture, you know, the way I grew up, you know, my mentality was always like, oh, mental health problems, that's for crazy people. Crazy people have mental problems. You know, the rest of us, you know, there ain't no, you know what I'm saying? Like depression, anxiety, these weren't terms and stuff that I'm like, oh yeah, the regular average person. To me, I'm like, it's extremes. It's either you're normal or you're crazy. And that's kind of the outlook I had on it because of the culture I grew up around, and not just Dominican culture, because I grew up in Miami, and so I grew up around a lot of other Hispanics and Caribbean people, as well as African Americans, and we're all in the same bucket, all with the same mentality when it came to mental health. So I had to come inside because the bugs was trying to act a little rambunctious, and I wasn't gonna deal with that. It's nighttime, and it's a lot of spiders on the upstairs patio, and I'm not trying to have all that. You know, I already got bit on the forehead by a mosquito earlier. And I gotta talk a little extra low just because I am in like the dining room and I have roommates, so I'm not trying to talk too loud and have them hear what I'm doing. You know, kind of awkward. But we shall progress. we are now in the toolbox section, okay? You know, it's impossible to find solutions for all the different mixtures of factors, but there are some general tools that can help, and that's what we're going to go over today. So tool number one is learn what you're dealing with. And as we already know, there can be some barriers, you know, to seeking access to things like psychologists, you know, getting a psychological evaluation and shit like that. But what we do have available to us is internet, you know what I'm saying? Good old internet. You know, we've got YouTubes and things like that. So, you know, use it to your advantage. And she does touch on the fact, like, you know, sometimes it's important to go and get a diagnosis, just because sometimes we can misdiagnose ourselves. And she spoke about how she had a friend that thought she had autism as well as ADHD, but kind of find out she was just OCD. She wasn't autistic, she had OCD. So I do understand, you know, the importance of that, but definitely just research as much as you can. You know what I'm saying? Do things like read a book, like we are doing right now. Read a book, get acquainted, learn, right? So tool number two is think holistically. And, you know, how can we think holistically? We can try some strategies such as, you know, getting curious. That kind of on what this whole entire chapter is about, which is like, it might not just be ADHD. You know, maybe you need to, you know, look at what other things could affect you. Like, you know, maybe you're depressed too, you know what I'm saying? Like, maybe you have ADHD, you're depressed and you're autistic, you know, but just like opening yourself up to the possibilities of other things and not boxing yourself into one thing, so that you can really treat yourself as a whole person, right? The second thing is understanding that you may need to treat other conditions first, which is a matter of like, you know, like, yeah, maybe, you know, yeah, you have ADHD, but it might be kind of hard to tackle, you know, your ADHD symptoms through this thick depression that you're in. And maybe it's a matter of, you know, tackling the most severe things first. You know what I'm saying? Don't focus on the thing that's not. Focus on whatever's impacting your life the most at this moment, you know. The next thing would be keep other factors in mind when considering strategies, which means it's just a matter of like, okay, like, yeah, maybe you want to try X, Y, and Z thing, but, you know, maybe you should keep in mind what your financial barriers are. You know, don't sink yourself into like debt, trying to, you know what I'm saying? Do certain things, or like just be aware maybe of like, you know, maybe you have certain time management issues and maybe certain strategies would not work well. You know, just be mindful of your situation, you know. The next thing would be looking for care that is informed about your intersectionalities. So, you know, this is like, you know, for example, when something that I have done, you know, myself, which is, you know, when looking for like the therapist, right? Look for a person who not only specializes in ADHD, but also, you know, is LGBTQI A plus whatever inclusive, right? Because maybe that's a part of your, you know, experience. You know, maybe you're a lesbian, right? It's definitely something I did, you know, when I had my last therapist. Like, I was very particular. And it was very hard. It took me quite some time to find a therapist. I started looking for a therapist at the very tail end of 2020, and I found a therapist in like the middle of 2022. So it took me like a year and a half, you know. It took me quite some time, but, you know, I don't regret, you know, taking my time. And I had other barriers as well, like financial barriers and just, you know, environmental stability that also prevented me and that made it so it took so long to get into therapy, you know. But the last thing would be make a plan for when things aren't okay. An example that she gives, which is something that, you know, maybe I should probably look into, but is creating a RAP plan, which is a wellness recovery action plan. And, you know, apparently that helps you to identify the tools that keep you well and create action plans to put them into practice in everyday life. I'm not entirely sure what that looks like, but that's an example. I would say that for me, I'm on the, you know, the more minimal side of the spectrum of ADHD. So I've definitely prioritized treating other things first in my life. Like, you know, like depression, you know, I've been in and out of depression for years. And I've definitely, you know, been aware, like, okay, like, I would say a lot of the other things I've dealt with are a lot heavier than the ADHD. The ADHD, I would say, hasn't crazily affected my life. There has been times where I feel like it has, but I think I've gone through other things that can be a lot heavier. Tool number 3 is seek community with people who share your coexisting conditions, identities, and background. That's a long tool, and it's a pretty self-explanatory thing. If you guys tuned into the last video, I was talking about ADHD and friendships, and part of one of the things I'm gonna, you know, do is this right here. You know, this will be a part of me going out to try to make friends, you know what I'm saying? And I feel like that's something I already do naturally, you know, seek like-minded people. Connection with others who get it is very healing, you know. It's healing to belong. Yeah, and that's a whole, check out the last video and you'll see a whole entire thing on that. It was a long video. I was yapping for almost an hour. So, and the last tool is respecting your own journey. Remember that, you know, you're an individual human being, and what works for another person might not work for you. Let's go ahead and dip into closing thoughts now, right? And, you know, the author's closing thoughts, she labeled this section, I'm dead. She labeled this section labels. I didn't even do that on purpose. And, you know, she just basically kind of touched on how there's a lot of labels that were discussed in this chapter. And how, you know, it can be overwhelming, and how some people don't really even like the label of ADHD in and of itself, you know. And she just talks about how, you know, she's, you know, heard from parents who don't want to go and get their kids diagnosed because, you know, they don't want these kind of labels on them, right? And I'm going to go ahead and quote her directly from the book, because this is her response, which I think is a great response. She says, "To those parents, I gently say, your child already has labels. Teachers, peers, and family all apply labels to your child as an attempt to explain behaviors they don't understand. Labels such as lazy, messy, spacey, and irresponsible are more stigmatizing, more shame-inducing, less accurate, and much, much less helpful than any diagnostic term will be." I get her on that. I do understand where she's coming from with that, you know. You know, she feels that like having an accurate label for your experience can help you really understand it, and it can give you access to treatments and accommodations and other support systems and what's not. I agree. You know, I agree. And that's what a lot of, you know, the closing thoughts are really on, is that the accessibility that labels can give us at times. She talks about an experience where she attended a keynote on, you know, this very subject. And, you know, at this keynote, everybody there kind of began to understand how important it was to see and be seen by people who understand, people who get it, who get the struggles, you know, the lows, the highs, you know, of having ADHD. It was a beautiful thing that she experienced, you know. And although it was a beautiful thing, it was still really hard to still connect with others, you know, because at the end of the day, there's other things at play, you know, the anxieties that people have, the traumas that people have. The woman who spoke at the keynote, her name was Renee, she told the author something, you know, and she said to her that labeling our experiences, just like labeling our emotions, can make them easier to understand. And communicating those experiences can build trust and connection, restoring access to what humans need most, one another. That's facts. That's facts. As hard as it may be to try to reach out to others, to try to connect with others because of all those other barriers, you know, we have, it can really make day-to-day easier, you know. And the last video, you know, that I talked about, connection is important. We're not solitary creatures, and you know, when we're going through certain things or when we have certain experiences, being able to connect with others who also have those experiences can make the load a little lighter to carry, you know. And speaking on my own closing thoughts when it comes to this section, you know, I feel like I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD growing up, but I don't regret it either. And I think I mainly say that because, you know, in my experience, because I'm on the more minimal side of the spectrum, I feel like it hasn't affected me to such an extreme degree that maybe for others it has. So from my experience alone, I don't really care that I didn't. But, you know, and even with certain labels that I got, I will say I had a really high confidence, high self-esteem. And so there's a lot of things I just didn't struggle with. A lot of ADHDers have struggled with. Certain labels can be very harmful, but you know, when it comes to ADHD as an adult, you know, fast forward, here I am as an adult now. I haven't gotten diagnosed, but what I have done is a lot of research, right? And I'm still learning every day. It's still a lot of research to do, but I will say that being able to have that label, you know, if that wasn't a label, you know, available and stuff, I wouldn't be able to learn as much as I have now thus far. Sometimes, like she said, labels can open the door to, you know, accessibility to care, support, treatments, things like that. And it's definitely opened up, because these labels exist, it's opened up a wealth of knowledge for me to better understand myself, you know. And that is it for this chapter, Wormlings. I will see you guys on the next video. And we'll be discussing chapter 12. I can't believe, like, we're getting there. We're getting there, though. We are getting there. But yeah, see y'all soon, wormlings.